Without further ado, here is Jason with some Linux open source history.
Hey, gang. So, some of you know me. I recognize some of the faces. Some of the faces I don't recognize. But as you can see, my name is Jason, and I'm very good at Photoshop. Some people say I look a little like Shrek. But yeah, there's my contact information at the bottom if you want to check me out. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before we go on. I guess I should. I've had, kind of the fortune to work for a bunch of different interesting companies over a period of time. Like, my background is mostly science, mainly because in the 80s, if you want to get into computer science at University of Waterloo, you had to be Asian or Indian, because we competed with Asian India, and they had like crazy high marks. We couldn't, if you're a Canadian, good luck. Unless you got 99 in high school, you wouldn't even be considered, right? So if you want to get into computer science, you had to go through science. And some of the most brilliant computer scientists that I worked with were scientists. So that's what I did. I love science, but I went to computer science from science, and I worked for the University of Waterloo. I was their first web developer. I built their library system that used to be called Trellis, if anyone knows what that is. Built their payroll system for the School of Accounting in DBA Explorer. That's old. Yeah, that was a nightmare. They still used it on a Windows 95 machine up until 2003. Oh. Yeah. Go figure, I was like shocked. But yeah, some interesting stuff. And I taught nuclear chemistry there too, a bunch of other stuff. Some of the famous companies I worked for on the screen, I worked for a lot of unfamous companies that are not slide worthy, but my favorite company was Sun Microsystems. You guys know what Sun is, right? So I worked for Sun in Calgary, in California, and mainly on writing drivers and interfaces for SunOS 4 and 5. If you guys know, SunOS 4 was basically DSD Unix. SunOS 5 was really great. They called it Solaris. So like that. Then I moved to Microsoft. Whenever I talk to Linux people and they say, hey, you work for Microsoft, I say I was young, needed money. And I did Motorola 68K assembly programming for Microsoft Word for Macintosh, back in the early 90s. That was a fun job. And then later on in the mid-90s, I worked for Digital Equipment Corporation, DEC. They were having rough financial times at the time, but I had a really cool job there. I was helping port the VMS operating system. I don't know if anyone knows what that is. Yeah, VMS. I was helping port that from VAX to DEC Alpha. So that was a really cool job. I learned a lot there. I worked with a lot of smart people. When I was at Sun, I worked with people like Whit Diffie, the co-inventor of asymmetric photography, who's an animal freak. You can talk to him about animals for like half an hour. Then you could ask him anything you want for the next hour. So I learned photography from the master. And all sorts of fun stuff. And SharpNet too. I don't know if anyone knows SharpNet. It's here in the university space. They know it today, but it's a very different organization than it began. It began as 100% DEC Alphas. So Compaq, which bought DEC at the time, put me there to make it work because they ran these big clusters of DEC Alphas on a quadrant switch from England, and I wrote the MPICH implementation that would spray out the instruction blocks of the switch to the different nodes, and did some interesting kind of things to optimize it. But it worked pretty well. But clusters in Canada are much smaller than the ones in the US. They have a lot more money, they get a lot more funding. So, it's not really famous worldwide even today. Go down to Virginia Tech or something and yeah, it's like third or fourth or something like that, right? Or the higher light in China. That DEC is still DEC Alpha based, but it's like #1 supercomputer in the world, right? So that's kind of my background. I found myself in the late 90s. I woke up one day, I was married with a kid. And that happens. And so I needed a 9-to-5 job. And I took one. And teaching at Waterloo, and then I moved to the private sector. So now I teach for Travis College, which is Canada's largest private college. The cool thing about teaching for private colleges is, one, it's good, and you can do what you want to do. There's less red tape. So I had time to write books, and they encouraged that. I had time to create apps. When the mobile app scene came around, I'm the author of one of the #1 solitaire apps for Android. So if you like solitaire and you open up your app and you look for the credits and you see someone named Harvey Lipschitz, That's me. I always use Harvey Lipschitz as my name whenever I ask. So I've had lots of fun there. So that's my background, guys. Let's move on to this. I've also written a lot of books. These are some of them. These are not all of them. You'll notice that most of them are on Linux. I like Linux. I've been doing Unix-like things and Unix-like programming since a long time ago. So I'm a very Unixy kind of person, and Linux is just open source Unix. I remember in the early 90s when it was really hard to install. It's like nailing Jello to a tree. It's kind of like installing Gentoo without the guide. And if you got the guide, it was all wrong. That was like 1992 or 3 installing Linux. We just farted around with it, and it's like, wow, I finally got it installed. 6 months and a beard later, right? You know, back then, if you wanted open source kind of Unix, you wanted free Unix and BSD. Right? So most of my books are on that, including all this Novell SUNY stuff. This book right here is the 4th edition, my first one. It was one of the first Linux authors in the market. So that's 3 million copies. You know, there's the #1 Linux book used in colleges worldwide. It's expensive, don't buy it. It's $250 or whatever, maybe a little bit more, right? So if you go to chapters, please don't buy it. You know, but I'm glad that colleges do. It funds my higher education. And I've done things I'm not proud of. For example, I wrote a book on Windows Vista. Yeah. And people, I can't count how many people have asked me to sign that book. But what they want on the front is me to sign Vista sucks, and then my name, right? And I do it because it does. Right? You know, I just exchange the book and Windows Server stuff. But most of my books are on Linux. So that's a little bit about me. So this talk is more like a fundamental talk. This is a Linux users group. So you guys know what Linux is. We've got some very advanced users in here, which is great. I love that kind of stuff. You know, if I know that someone's an advanced Linux user, I'll email them, and at the very bottom, you'll see a :WQ or something, just for fun. Yeah, let me get that joke. And nobody's here. Everyone here uses Pi, right? 99. Yeah, not that good. All right, that's a viable skill for the industry. But where Linux started was actually the 1940s. It wasn't 1991 in Helsinki with Linus Torvalds. You have to go further back because there's a lot of great history of computer science, and it all leads to Linux. Well, Unix and then Linux, right? So in the 40s, look at that picture. Anyone know what company that is from? No, well, they're using IBM machines, adding machines, but that's a computer department. Who saw the movie Hidden Figures recently? One person. What did they call the department at NASA where they had the ladies adding up the numbers? They call it the computers department because your job was you were a computer, you computed numbers. And so after World War II, companies were bigger than they ever were in history. Anything that started with General, like General Electric, this is General Electric, by the way. General Electric, General Motors, the reason they were called General is because they were founded in the war, okay? And we got companies that are 10, 50, 100 times bigger than they were in the 30s. So to do their accounting, their generally accepted accounting principles, and have responsible numbers so we don't have that stock market crash, right? They had to crunch numbers all day long. Some companies had more people crunching the numbers on these adding machines in the computer department than they had on the factory floor. Right? So that funded computer science, the need to replace these computers with a machine. Right? By the way, those machines were made by International Business Machines, or IBM, and they got into the computer business. So by the 50s, you pretty much had something like this, right? That was, they didn't call it the computer at the time, they called it the mainframe, the IBM, or the General Electric. General Electric made mainframes, Honeywell made mainframes. Digital Equipment Corporation got into it later on with kind of like smaller mainframes that were more affordable, better performing, and stuff like that. There's all sorts of manufacturers. There's a ton of manufacturers of mainframes, right? Big computers, an excuse to have a lot of metal to print a balance sheet is what they were. But the problem was, is you got these big expensive computers only in the largest companies, and yeah, sure, you could do things a lot faster, but they were still very expensive, just as expensive as having that big department where you're paying all those computing people to crunch the numbers on those adding machines. So they really weren't saving money, right? So what happened is they decided to kind of band together and say, you know what, we got lots of great hardware. General Electric makes great hardware, Honeywell makes great hardware, AT&T makes great mainframes too, IBM makes great mainframes, Big Blue, right? But they all run their own proprietary software. The OS is a pain in the butt to make. And if you want to make changes, it's also a pain in the butt to make. Why don't we do it once for everybody? So what they wanted is a portable operating system. Something that will run on all the hardware that you make. And so they invented this project called Multics. And Multics was designed to, it stood for Multiplex Information Computing System. And it was a great project. These companies banded together and said, hey, let's make a portable operating system that will run on all of our junk. The problem is even though they spent, by today's dollars, billions of dollars into this project, it was too poorly managed, too overscoped. They wanted to achieve too much in too little time, and it fell apart. If anyone's worked in development, you kind of know that happens a lot, right? Now we call it the waterfall model back then. We call it agile now. It's not agile now. It's the typical way of software development today is, I see this girl that I want to marry, but I haven't asked her out yet. So that's how software managers projects are managed, pretty much in a nutshell, right? We know what we want to do, and okay, now you got to do it. Oh, good luck trying to get that to happen, maybe, right? So it failed. It failed big time. It failed, and it's not coming back. So what happened was AT&T had a bunch of people that were paid to kind of do research and development, like most companies back then. They always had like this R&D kind of department, and two of them were at Bell, and I don't know if you know these two people. One on the left is Ken Thompson, and on the right is Dennis Ritchie. Yeah. Ken Thompson said, you know what, the reason Multics failed is because it went in too many directions. It was crazy. Why don't we take it in one direction and finish it? And he did. And he called it, not Multics, but Unix with a C. And Dennis Ritchie was working on the C programming language at the time, well, B and then C. And C is a wonderful language. It's my favorite language still today. Is it anyone else's favorite language? No? C++ maybe? That's my second favorite. No. But yeah, it's a beautiful language, and it was very portable. So what they did is they rewrote Unix in C, and then they called it Unix with an X, because that's way cooler, right? So, that's where Unix came from. And January 1st, 1970 is, of course, an important date in our world. What is that? The epoch, the birth of the universe, right? Because Unix was the first portable operating system. It could run on anything. And because it was written in C, it was just a beautiful piece of software that managed to take over the world in the next decade. The only problem is, these two guys worked for AT&T Bell Labs. AT&T was under a federal court order at the time, restraining them from selling software. They were a monopoly. They couldn't sell Unix. Oh, that sucks, eh? AT&T was, if you look back in history, they were, the federal government treated them pretty harshly. They were like, you cannot sell software. I guess you'd call that an epoch fail, right? That's the comment. But, AT&T was like, okay, who cares? We can't sell it? Fine. What we're going to do? Let's sell the source code to it. We could do that legally. It's not, we're not banned from selling the source code. It's not software. It's just source code. So that's what they did. They sold the source code to everyone who would buy it, which was everyone and their mother. And that's where we got Unix flavors from. So look at all these types of Unix. In the 80s, 70s, and 80s, it ruled the world. All the big systems ran Unix. They didn't run Unix, they were about to run Unix. Even Cray computers, started to run their own OS, and they decided in the 80s, well, heck with this, let's run Unix. They called it Unicos, right? There's actually a book on that you can read, and it's called 50 Shades of Cray. That was a joke, guys. But if you look at this, you'll notice that there's one out of place. You know which one's out of place? Microsoft had Xenix, that's not out of place. There's one that didn't buy the source code. BSD. Yeah, see what AT&T did is they sold the source code off, but they wanted to maintain control over its development. So what do you do to maintain control of development? You buddy up with universities. They gave away 3 copies of the source code. They gave one to the University of Waterloo. They did nothing with it. They gave one to the University of Mannheim in Germany. They did nothing with it. They gave a copy to the University of California at Berkeley, which created Berkeley Software Distribution, or BSD. And that was AT&T's kind of way of saying, well, you know, these vendors do anything they want with our Unix source code, which they legally could. They bought the source code. They made different flavors of Unix. So Sun Unix was very different on the source code level after a few, you know, years of development than, say, you know, something like SCO Unix or, you know, IBM ZIX or something like that. So it was very fragmented. Unix was fragmented. It wasn't a common kernel. The kernel was very different from Unix flavor to Unix flavor to Unix flavor. And to make it worse, we got BSD out there, which is doing a lot of development very aggressively, their own way, kind of going down a different path. So Unix was very fragmented in the 80s, and what that did is it kind of made it very expensive to develop because companies knew that they could charge a lot for their flavor. And they kind of knew that everyone else could charge a lot, kind of like gas stations. You know, if Shell's charging this much, Esso can charge that much, right? And so this type of development was actually very, very bad when it came to developing software. If you wanted to develop a Unix application, one, you had to get, you know, a PhD student, and you had to pay them a lot of money, and then you sold it for a lot of money. And you charged a huge profit margin, right? That doesn't do well for computer science and development. And it bothered one very important person, our Lord and Savior, Richard Stallman, right? He was working for the artificial intelligence labs at MIT, and he quit. He quit a job, and he said, you know what? I'm just going to make free software. I'm going to encourage people to make free software because I hate this Unix stuff, right? And he formed the Free Software Foundation, and eventually what he wanted people to do is he wanted people to think that when you write source code, it should be free so other people could improve upon it, right? He called that free software, which, as we all know, is not a great term. I don't like the word free software, I'll be honest. Because free means, hey, it's free. Yeah, sure, it could be free. Free means, you know, free source code, right? Open source is a better term for it, right? So what he wanted to do back in the 80s was he wanted to actually get rid of Unix. He wanted to make a free version of Unix that people would develop software for that was free software. And he called that project, you know, the GNU project. GNU's not Unix. And it never really kind of came to fruition back then. I mean, there's GNU Herd today and stuff like that, but I mean, you know, back then it was slow. People didn't want to do it. And you know what? Most free software developers were like 3rd and 4th year math students or computer science students. And you know what? They just wanted to make a small utility. Here, let's improve Emacs. Let's make an FTP utility. So a lot of the stuff we got out of the Free Software Foundation were little utilities like this. But what really kind of set the stage for Linux was not this free software stuff. It was what Richard Stallman did afterwards. He had a lot of really good friends in academia, including like very famous lawyers like Eben Moblin and stuff like that. He got them to draft up the first GPL, the new public license, right? The first open source license, the first copyleft license. And, you know, in a nutshell, it basically says if you publish your software to the GPL, you got to keep the source code free forever. So someone modifies it, they have to release that source. They're bound legally to release that source code. It's been taken to court dozens of times by companies that didn't want to follow those rules, and you know, the court held it up every single time. It was just a well-written legal document, and it's been through several revisions, right, since its conception. But now we have like so many open source licenses. How many open source licenses are out there? Does anyone know? I have no idea because I don't care, but there's a lot, right? You choose the one that fits your needs the most. And they all have different types of restrictions and stuff like that. So really, if it wasn't for that GPL, it wasn't for Richard Stallman's GPL, and the fact that Unix this portable operating system was taking the world by storm and was heavily fragmented, companies were making money from it, we wouldn't have Linux. Because in 1991, this guy came around, and just like, me, when I was in university, kind of wore the same sweater, definitely told people you didn't have an active social life, right? So if you're taking this course in university, anywhere around the world, about how operating systems are developed, your prof probably chose a textbook written by Andrew Tannenbaum. And this book is called Operating Systems Design and Implementation. And I took a course where I had this exact same book that Linus Torvalds had, right? And in the back of it was a 5 1/4 inch floppy of mini Unix or Minix. And if you went through this book, you pretty much made Minix. But you have to have like no social life to kind of spend that much time. And well, he was the first. Right? So he improved upon it. And eventually it was called Linux. So he took that book and there we go, we got Linux over there. Right? What made it important was he published it under the GPL. And so now you got a whole bunch of 3rd and 4th year math students at universities worldwide who are like, okay, do I want to work on a little FTP utility that's open source, or do I want to improve an entire operating system? And so it took off like wildfire. Yeah, it was hard at first, but people were like, yeah, hey, let's play around with this whole operating system. Let's get into this. This is kind of cool, right? And so now, of course, we have a common Linux kernel that's not fragmented. Common Linux kernel library, still centrally developed by a committee, right? And you just package whatever software you want on top of it and call it a Linux distribution. Oh, done. There's a better Unix, and it's open source. So, of course, we have lots of Linux distributions out there. What's your favorite Linux distro?
Mint.
Mint, really? Ubuntu? I like the word Ubuntu. What is that? That's an ancient African word for I can't configure Debian, right? Just kidding. I'll leave Ubuntu too. Anyone else? CentOS? Yeah. No Gentoo nerds in here? No masochists?
Tried it. Was fun. Thank you.
Yeah, I was actually, before they disassembled machines at Waterloo, we had our 16,000, I think it was an Onyx cluster or something like that in the back of the 3rd floor of the Mac Computer Building. And I was one of the people who ported Gen 2 to the R14 16,000 platform. And the binaries are still there on some server somewhere, just not on the Gen 2 page. Probably should fix something. That was a lot of work. But yeah, no, I like Fedora a lot. Fedora is my favorite. It's just Linux, it's just an operating system. Software that runs on it is more important, right? But as soon as Linux came out, that's when open source really took off, right? There was open source everywhere in the academic scene, but when Linux took off, then it was like, here's this fight to get open source software on this new open source operating system. It did wonders for Linux, it did wonders for BSD. Apache did wonders for BSD. In fact, in the early days of the internet, if we didn't have Apache, I mean, every ISP ran Apache. It was crucial to getting the web up and running. Not many people realize how critical Apache was. Right? But it did wonders for it. And of course, these must be 3rd or 4th year, CS students and math students, right? Yeah. Let's do this. But here's a quick timeline that you might realize or not realize, and it's happened over the last little while. It wasn't until '96 that Linux got Tux as their mascot, right? Does anyone know the story behind that? Oh, if you can look up old news group posts, but I mean, I was a news group junkie in the 80s and 90s.
Australia.
Yeah, Australia. But what happened was, I remember the news group thread. I can't remember. It was comp.os.alternate.unix or something like that. And people were like, were recommending that a mascot for Linux. And this one guy wanted like a bald eagle from the U.S. One guy wanted, someone wanted the GNU, bird, that little beefy little thing. And then Linus Torvalds came in and his post was like, I'm fond of penguins. And I was like, okay, well, he's the probably, let's just end this thread.
It was
The
actually
penguin.
on a vacation on the beach somewhere in Australia, I think, New Zealand, and then the penguin came to him, and that's how they...
And that's what he replied to that post. I'm fond of penguins. Great. And then, because you know what? Of all the other things that are recommended, it was the least crazy. You know, which says a lot. But here's the fun thing. I mean, you can read this by yourself, but I mean, Red Hat claimed that they had 750,000 installed in 98. They were the first real Linux distribution that really took off, right? But 2001 was a really interesting year. 2000 was a really interesting year. That's when you saw the Linux companies start. Before the dot-com bust, there was Linux University, there was a bunch of really weird Linux companies. It just popped up everywhere. And Linux was huge. It was on, I mean, you could see, you know, it on television even. You know, people were investing in these Linux companies. But really, what really takes the cake is IBM was in a transitional period. They were trying to kind of get rid of their server business, and you know, they had a rough time in the 90s, and they saw the future of being, hey, let's be the biggest MSP in the world, managed solutions provider in the world. And that's what they are right now. They're the largest MSP in the world. You go to Scotiabank, not one IT person in Scotiabank is paid by Scotiabank, they're paid by IBM. They go to work every day at Scotiabank, but they're IBM employees, right? I mean, all the big systems, and IBM drops in that hardware, they run Linux on almost everything they can, and so they have a vested interest in making this work. The big companies, Dell and all that stuff, kind of took notice and said, hey, this is cool, this gives us power, right? It's open source. And so, if I'm just going to cut that a little bit short. I'm going to show you a quick video that kind of drills it in. I don't know if you've seen this commercial, but let me open up this. This is going to take me a few seconds here because I've got the dual screen there.
1991 Helsinki, a 21-year-old student named Linus told
Okay, so I'm just going to pause that, go to the beginning, make it big. There we go. And play it again. Okay, can you guys see that?
Yes.
1991 Helsinki, a 21-year-old student named Linus Torvalds writes a new computer operating system. He calls it Linux. It does something revolutionary. He gives it away, free, over the internet. The powers that be dismiss him as an eccentric, a freak. But everywhere coders and free thinkers embrace Linux, improve and refine it. Now the forces of openness have a powerful and unexpected new ally. It's a different kind of world. We need a different kind of software.
Pretty cool commercial, right? Anyone seen that? Yeah, lots of them. But what's really cool about that commercial is not the commercial itself, it's the fact that, let me just do that. Oh, yeah, I forgot to press the shift key. There we go. A little more. Perfect. Okay, it's not the fact that, you know, it was a cool commercial, it's the fact that the big companies cared. If it wasn't for that, Linux would still be a fledgling project, right? I mean, the internet allowed open source developers to really collaborate back in the 90s, and it was Linux that was kind of like the you know, the thing that fueled a lot of that development, right? And it was 2001 when Linux decided to just give away, here's $1 billion. You got an open source project, submit your proposal, we'll give $1 billion. It's kind of like what Google does with the, you know, the student code promotion rate. You get 5,000 US and you submit your open source project every summer, right? They still do that, right? Companies are giving money away to open source projects intelligently, right? That commercial was from 2000. By 2001, IBM was making a ton of money on Linux, tons of it, and everyone else was too. They were just the biggest names, right? And then, of course, if you want to estimate the number of Linux installs, well, I'm not sure if these numbers are completely accurate because I couldn't get a good idea of how they got them from like the Linux counter organization, but they're reasonably accurate, you know, 29 million and 64 million in 2008, but it got really hard after that point until you do it by platform, and I'll show you that in a few seconds. But it's very real that there's some kind of exponential growth there, and that, you know, in 2009, when Fedora 14 came out, they actually measured the impact it had on the internet. That's how it's it. Now, this is the slide that took me the most time to get. And these numbers are somewhat accurate. Okay, is what I'm going to say. And the reason they're somewhat accurate is because you can measure the number of supercomputers in the world and the number that are running Linux. That's easy, it's a smaller number, right? When it comes to embedded devices, embedded hardware manufacturers love to list the operating system that runs in their hardware. It's just one of the things that embedded hardware manufacturers always do. So you can find out that yes, your thermostat on the wall is running Linux. Your coffee maker has an IP address. Ours does. At work, it does, and you can get SSH access to it. And the only reason I knew that happened is because something floated around the internet that some guy had made a script to email his boss when he wasn't in the office by 9 a.m. or make coffee automatically at a certain time. And when I saw that script, I thought, well, maybe our coffee maker supports that. So I was able to easily find that, yes, it's running Linux 2.4 kernel, but it's got SSH open. And there's an Ethernet port in the back of the coffee maker. That's a good sign. Right? So we had some fun there at work. But 82% of smartphones, that's easy because there's lots of organizations that like to monitor that kind of stuff. Tablets is easy. Servers was a lot harder. That's the total for cloud, clients, and on-premises. On-premises is only like 11%. So on an on-premises Linux server, that's only 11%. That's still a small market share. But when you go to cloud, the market share is massive. It's almost 90, and appliances overnight. That's your next generation firewalls like Barracudas and Certified Fireboxes and stuff like that. They're all running Linux. Why? Because you're a hardware manufacturer, you have Linux at your disposal. It's an open source operating system you can use and customize yourself. So that's the kind of stuff I see. And only 6% of desktops, that's not unusual. Who runs Linux on a desktop here? I don't, I'll be honest with you. I run Windows or Mac OS, which is, well, Unix. Right? But I used to run Linux on my desktop. I treat it more as a server. I have a lot of Linux servers. But yeah, some people do, some people don't. I don't know. But it's just kind of a fact. And if you kind of get that last number, I had to calculate myself. Basically, I took everything else and added some reasonable, unknowns, plus or minus 10%, and figured out that, yeah, it's roughly around 53% plus or minus 2. So it's over half of all the devices in the world estimated run Linux. But it's a hidden thing. People don't know that. Linux is not a household term for most people. Right? They don't realize that Android is Linux and drag, right? They don't realize that kind of stuff. Right? But that's the nature of it. Has anyone ever read these books? No? One person? Okay. This is what, when people who don't know anything about Linux, if they say, I want to learn more about open source and free software, these are the two books I recommend. So this is Richard Stallman's manifesto kind of thing, right? It's actually really well written, easy to read. He didn't write it. But it's really well done, and it really tells you what free and open source software is to a T. And then the one on the right is, Eric S. Raymond's Cathedral and the Bazaar. A little harder to read, more of an academic read, but the points are phenomenal in it. And basically these two books tell you why companies find open source software sexy. Right? I mean, if your company is investing your entire operations in something like Microsoft SQL Server, which is a proprietary product, then Microsoft decides, hey, you know what? We're not making enough money on this product. It's going. It's axed. No more updates, nothing. Your whole company's built on this. Now you have a choice. You can either move to another product at huge cost, migrate. You can't continue using that product. You can't continue improving it yourself because it's closed source. But if it was open source, even if nobody else in the world wants to develop it, you can pay developers to develop it. Isn't that cool? So finally, in the last decade, most companies understand this. Go back 20 years, 30 years, not every company understood it. Some of them did, Netscape did. After reading the Cathedral and the Bazaar. Yeah, someone from Netscape read that book and then went into a senior management meeting and said, you know what, we got to do this. And it happened. Right? So that's kind of important. The other thing is don't forget Unix too. Yeah, I've spent most of my life with Unix, and Linux is really just like an open source Unix. Unix is kind of like a train of thought, right? It's the same thought, it's the same way of thinking, right? And when I worked for Sun Microsystems, I was young and stupid, and we had this fundraiser that, where you could get tattooed for charity. And I volunteered, so the women got tattoos on their ankles, I got one on my arm. Yes. In retrospect, that was probably a really bad idea, and it hurt. yeah, it's still out there. Unix is still there. Solaris is still there. I still do presentations for Oracle, which is an evil company, but they pay me well. And, you know, because I'm one of the few people from Sun Microsystems that will still talk to them. And, yeah, so that Apple, of course, is, well, Apple is Next Step Unix with a lot of FreeBSD work in it, right? Like a third of the kernel is the FreeBSD part of the networking stuff. The XMU kernel is a third BSD, a third mock, and then the glue it together is IO-Kit, which Next Step kind of made. So that's kind of interesting. There's FreeBSD and QNX, but there's lots of Unix out there too. But here's the interesting thing. If you look at this, if you look over the last 4 decades, what has kind of happened is the 80s, I mean, free software was network tools, small utilities that you could do, right? And then the Linux came out. People were like, let's make this operating system work. And then now it's Linux software, now it's diversification. And if you're to look at what we're doing in the future, basically, whenever you want to predict anything, you have to keep a few things in mind. And very important, first and foremost, is Linux runs on anything, right? You know, there was a comic I saw online. It was you know, the difference between a computer engineer and a computer scientist. The computer scientist, wow, this is a foreign piece of hardware. We have to study it. We don't know what civilization made this. And you know, the computer engineer at the bottom, boom! I got Doom thrown in this thing, right? Replace Doom with Linux, and that's pretty much, you know, how many people install Linux on something just because, hey, I want to see if I can install Linux on this thing. You want to handle hardware in their company? Just install. Yeah, I've done it. Yeah. There's actually there's a book out there called Installing Linux on a Dead Badger. It's hilarious. Yeah, and it's exactly the same process you would if you had to install it on an old Sunbox or SGI box or something like that. Just like nailing Delta tree, try to install Gen 2 on an SGI Octane. Yeah, wow. There's a good 6 months of your life, huh? When you get it to work, right? So stuff like that. So Linux is everywhere, and the fun thing is we're in Linux. Technology always goes in 2 cycles. Right? There's always that invent, then there's a paradigm shift, and it changes into something that people want, and then it reinvents, then it changes. And if you look at the smartphone market right now, who here has an Android phone? Anyone here have an iPhone? So a couple iPhones. Well, here's the thing. Apple deserves a lot of credit for kind of getting the smartphone industry where it needed to go. The last paradigm shift was computer as a device, which was BlackBerry, to smartphone as a device, which was BlackBerry, to smartphone as a computer in your pocket, which Apple kind of started, and Android followed a year later, right, when Google bought it, right? So they deserve the credit for it because they own the hardware and the software. They can make the user experience nice and easy so people will adopt it and pay a high price for that device. The problem is what made it succeed were apps. Are apps ubiquitous today? Yeah. Who cares? Does anyone talk about the latest, greatest app anymore? Occasionally. Does it matter what platform it's on? No, it's on every platform. Right? So what's the next phase? The next phase is things like virtual reality, augmented reality, the next generation technologies. And those technologies will favor open development. Right? So we're seeing them now supported only on Android, not iOS. You know, Apple would have to spend a tremendous amount of effort modifying it, give it some cute name like, hey, Retina VR or something like that, right? So in the next, we're approaching that second cycle where it's going to be a little harder for them to compete. And if you went to GDC, the Game Development Conference in California last month, you'll notice something really impressive. Game developers always release their games on iOS first in the past because they knew that iOS developers would pay for the game. Android users are a little cheaper, right? I'll be honest, I follow that effort. I have both phones, by the way. Can't just have one, right? Yeah, they've always done that. This year, it was opposite. And it was opposite because of things like VR and emerging technologies. And so, Apple's kind of like the Sony Beta VCR, closed. And Android's kind of like the open VHS standard. Which one won the 80s? VHS. And so we're in that shift. And so that's something important to remember about Linux. Linux has that same kind of, 2-cycle technology, evolution. And so now that open source is getting critical mass and companies are liking it, what's the next shift? How are we going to use this better? And so there's going to be another platform where it gets developed. It's not just the mobile world. I think we're on the brink of having more and more open technologies, including Linux-based operating systems with open source software on top of them, right? I never would have thought that before. So companies are finding this, and they're really liking open source. So basically, what made Linux succeed before was the internet, and having a bunch of people who wanted to develop open software, and then having big companies notice. It doesn't have to be big, it can be any company now. Same ingredients to make it succeed. So what about the future? Let's check this out. I don't think Linux is going to be a household term for a long time. Does anyone else? No. Most Linux people, you know, if Linux is a household, if your social group, you know, knows a lot about Linux, talks a lot about Linux, they're probably developers of some type, like that comment says. Yeah. Where did you meet? Windows users at the office, Apple users at Starbucks, Linux users. I did at least Linux users aren't afraid to commit, right? Nobody gets I had that in my own humor. All right, so yeah, so that's the thing, but it's going to be a bit more mainstream, I think. I don't think it's going to be a household term. I don't think your mother's going to talk about Linux. But she might realize, hey, that LG fridge that she just bought with that touch screen that browses the internet is actually running Linux. Maybe there's a Linux logo or icon or something in there that tells her so much. You know, it's not just Android, it's got like something to do there. You never know. I don't know. We don't. But that's kind of what I hope happens in the next, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years. And it's just going to continue growing in every single hardware market, in every single software market, in every single need. If you need something to do, so like for example, Adobe right now, anyone use Adobe software, Creative Cloud? It's expensive, isn't it? They force you to pay this cloud subscription because they know they have a monopoly.
And then they try to punish you if you try to cancel it.
Oh yeah, they're evil. They're evil because they can be evil. Companies like to be evil if they can be. It's like, hey, what's stopping us from getting all this money, right? Well, guess what? That's just an invitation to ramp up those open source competitors to, you know, right now the GIMP sucks, but it might not suck in 5 years, right? And there's a great alternative to Illustrator that someone told me, I can't remember the name of it, life me starts to decay. But I saw it and I was like, wow, that's really good. It just kind of came out of the woodwork a year ago, and it's stable and fast. And so it's inviting competition. That's where open source is. Open source will be there in case something kind of falls out of balance, it'll bring it back in, the competition, right? So I think that's going to continue happening in the future. Anyone agree with me? Yeah, one person, two, that's a record. Holy moly. Everyone else thinks I'm full of it, that's okay. So that's what I think. Every market's going to grow. I think the on-premises market's going to grow a lot more than it is now. It's only 11%, right? 10.8 or something like that percent is what I can find. That's fairly measurable. But anyone know about MS SQL, Microsoft SQL vNext?
It's not an April Fool's joke this year.
No. I've been using vNext for a while. Microsoft's been using it for 3 years. If you install SQL Server vNext, it's as simple as, say you got Ubuntu. Add the private repository for Microsoft, then it's apt-get. And suddenly you have Microsoft SQL running, and on a Windows machine, like a Windows 10 client, you can open up SSMS and connect to it, and it's like, wow, this is a fully fledged SQL server, only runs way faster. My load testing script on the same hardware ran 7.5 times faster under heavy load on the same hardware than if you ran Microsoft SQL Server 2016 on Windows Server 2012. Whoa.
You know what I think on that first line, the server on-premise, I think that the shift is going to happen because there's going to be a reduction on-premise, moving to cloud, where it's mostly...
Yeah, and you know what? That's the kicker.
That's where...
Microsoft a month ago just let it slip. Oh, by the way, if you use Microsoft SQL Server in the cloud, it was right under budget for the last 3 years. That's how we developed it. That's how we developed the Hadoop support built into Microsoft SQL Server called Polynext or whatever. Holy moly. Azure is mostly a bunch of it. They have their own Linux certification too, Microsoft does, right? Yeah. And all future versions of Microsoft SQL Server are not going to be supported on Microsoft Windows Server anymore after vNext. That's why it's called version next. Satya Nadella was at the LinuxCon North America this past summer. Anyone at LinuxCon North America? The $1,300 ticket? Yeah. I got it for free because I have friends who work back there. That's where I get true. But I saw him tell everyone the future of our platform is running our services on Linux. Pretty impressive, eh? Can you imagine Steve Ballmer saying that?
The .NET platform is
This
the
is Head of
.NET
Explorer
Core.
first. What's that, sorry?
The .NET platform is the .NET.
.NET runs
Shifted
perfectly
to
on
.NET
Linux right
Core.
now. Active Directory runs on Linux. Exchange is next to it.
.NET,
DirectX.
so near Linux.
Imagine if they put that on Linux. There's your competition to OpenGL, right? I mean, like, they're not a dumb company. They're embracing open source a lot. That's pretty cool. In my mind, I never would have thought Microsoft would have ever done that in a million years.
They have a lot of, Microsoft Virtual Academy has a lot of courses on open source software like Python and Django, all stuff that's
Yeah.
really non-Microsoft.
For Xamarin, they bought Xamarin last year. That's the future of app development. I mean, most projects now, they have 1 million Xamarin developers back in 2015, they have 6 million now, worldwide. If you want to make an app, you got to have it on Android and iOS. End of story. But you want to have an Android team that develops it, doesn't want to talk to the iOS team, you have features that are different revs, and the project manager who goes between the two groups has, got a vein sticking out of his forehead all the time. No. What you do is you have a common code base in C#, and you take its native development, you take the native controls and everything from Android and from iOS. Everything is developed at the same time, version upgrades are released at the same time, it's elegant, it's beautiful, it's native app development.
What's it called?
It's actually Xamarin. Xamarin. Xamarin.
That was following the Facebook project, the ads. That was the one I knew about.
I have no idea. I've never heard of that. Xamarin is the hottest thing since sliced bread in the developer world right now. It's incredible. If you play with it, it's amazing. I mean, I've developed all new projects actually in the company that I'm kind of doing a little bit of development work on the side for in the app space just because I like to fart around with apps. I have nothing to do between 10 p.m. and 2 in the morning, right? So I start with a scrum meeting and I develop until 2 a.m. until my dog tells me to go to sleep. So I'm itching for a new project. I just finished one. And all the new projects are Xamarin. Yeah. Why spend twice as much money? We can spend half the money, have the same dev team and build and storm. It's still native development on both sides. You have to see how this thing works. I could do a whole presentation on Xamarin. That's how much I use it.
Deal.
Yeah. I don't have one prepared for you, but yeah. If you're a developer, who here is a developer? Not a developer, check with Xamarin. Yeah. There goes your weekend. You'll get addicted to it. It's like crack. So.
But there is also the other trend for web, yeah.
Yeah, you can make web
mobile
apps.
development, kind of cross-platform development from web perspective.
Yeah, that's right. And things like adaptive web technology is very, very important now. So it looks the same on all devices. Having the back end, the fat back end and the thin front end, so you can make apps right now get published for Android and iOS. And basically, they look like an app icon, but they're really a web page. You don't know it's a web page. It's a single page app that goes to some nice fat back end. I like having things on the internet more than
Yeah,
phone.
Angular and Facebook React.
Angular does great
They
single page
moved
apps,
to
yeah.
mobile development.
AngularJS, yeah. I use Angular a lot. Yeah.
Like web frameworks for mobile development.
Yeah,
And desktop.
there's always going to be some new JavaScript framework, right? There's always going to be. That's the beautiful thing, right?
I'm thinking about that. So I've leveled up to Angular 2 recently, and I'm loving it so far. But with the WebAssembler, we're looking at C.
Wow.
I mean, that's the same thing. We now have a common platform to build off of.
Yeah, that's the way it should be. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, the development world has never looked better in these last few years. So I'm spending my 10 p.m. till 2 in the morning doing it because I'm thinking, wow, I never would have thought it would be this cool. I remember in the early 90s, one of the projects I worked on for the University of Waterloo was they had a room full of white Sharp X68000 computers, or little white PCs, which were novelty items back in the 90s. I was like, what the heck is this? Walked into the room, and the prof was from Japan. It was paid for by Capcom. they were doing a Skunkworks project trying to make Street Fighter 2 into Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting Edition, fast on the same river. So I joined it 1 month in, and I made the sprite engine for the background sprites in Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting Edition. But, I mean, back then, it was assembly. That was hard. 7 months to do all that. Little bit of work, tiny bit of work. You know, now it's like, wow, it's like limitless. It's like you've got like this sandbox, you can play with anything, right? And it could be JavaScript frameworks, it could be Xamarin, it could be anything you want. I mean, you can use common languages. I mean, things like languages like Python. When they came out, I was like, yeah, this is awesome. I can read this much faster because of the white space. I can think like that. C and C++, it's hard to think in C and C++ without a lot of training, or a lot of practice, for better, that's a better word, right? And in fact, there's, you know, thinking in C. There's actually a book called that, I think I saw on a shelf once. I didn't read it, but it's on the shelf. So that's kind of cool. But that's what I see, guys. And remember I mentioned GDC? You know, the Android versus Apple stuff? The first time ever. I mean, it's always been, hey, release your game on Apple first because we know there's paying customers. And if you want to get an OMIDC grant from the Canadian government to develop your game, you had to publish on Apple first. That was always one of the conditions. Not so anymore. Whoa. Yeah, so open technology, I think, is really going to drive the future. In the next 5 years, like not maybe 5 years from now, but like next year, the year after, the year after, the year after, who knows what happens after 5 years, right? And of course, in the embedded stuff too, the Internet of Things or whatever they call it. I hate those terms. I don't like to call the Internet cloud. You know, anyone hate that? It used to be called, they used to call it the information superhighway if anyone's old. Remember that? And then the web 2.0. You know why they call it the cloud, right? Some suits wandered into some IT room by accident, saw a network diagram on the wall, and that's a symbol for the Internet. Cloud. Hey, it's called the cloud in our next management meeting. That looks cool, right? Great. Still server farm computing, right? So stuff like that. But that's kind of where I think it's going to go. I mean, it's hard to predict this industry, but it's not hard if you listen to it carefully and you kind of know a few things and you know history. I see history repeat itself all the time, right? I mean, I predicted the kind of a stupid growth of Apple back in the early 2000s. The fall of RIM. That was easy. Because I was in this area. What a terrible company. Actually, I had to work with those area. And then, you know, I predicted Microsoft kind of going to open source like several years ago. And I was kind of like unsure about that one, you know, like, these are kind of like things you banter with your friends, right? But it's just, you know, you see so much stuff happen again and again over 30 years and you realize, hey, there's patterns to this. You get a good feel for it. It's not hard, you know, if you know, some of the stuff we talk about may come true. So let's go here and here first, yeah.
Can you bring back the slide with Unix?
With Unix, okay.
Because I believe there is room for Linux, Windows, and Unix.
Oh yeah, I think Unix will still be here in a while. BSD.
If you are interested, there is an interesting talk by Mark Rubinovich, that's a Microsoft fellow, and he makes a parallel between Windows 10 and Linux. And you see on YouTube talks that are saying that Windows 10 kernel has a Linux.
Well, they have an Ubuntu system, a full Ubuntu from Canonical in the Windows 10 anniversary update. Problem is, there's no networking. It's like, come on, I've got like rsync, I've got SSH in there, and I can't connect to the, you know, even a virtual network adapter. That'd be great. I could get stuff.
And other guys are saying that if you look at Windows, if you look at Linux kernel, you'll see elements from Windows 10. Yeah. So,
well, who knows? Maybe Microsoft is going to do what Apple is. You guys know that Mac OS X is 80% Darwin, which is open source, and Apple just does the 20% on top of it for the GUI and makes it proprietary. You can still download Darwin OS and just stick GNOME on it instead, and then you've got a full OS, right?
Yeah.
They've done that since the late 90s because they knew that they didn't have the money to develop a whole operating system. They were starving at the time. And so they decided, hey, without telling anyone, we're going to take advantage of open source. And they kind of coddle the FreeBSD community, which they still do, to continue that development, which has had some bumps along the way. A lot of which I can tell you afterwards. But I'm heavily involved in that community. But what if Microsoft decides that they don't really do what Apple does? We don't make money off of Windows, we make money off of Office. Right? Windows, we spend more money doing the darn updates than we do from the OS. So, we spend more money doing the updates than we do from the OS. So you know what? They don't make money off of Windows. Why don't we do what Apple does? 80% of Windows will be Linux, and the 20% will charge for it. Maybe that's why they put Ubuntu inside Windows 10. I don't know. Kind of an interesting speculation.
Well, I mean, Android's the UI.
Yeah, Android's just, it's Linux and drag, right? It's just the Android framework on top, right?
So will it be a Windows 11 or it's going to be Linux?
Well, they said there's going to be no Windows 11. It'll just be Windows 10 version, or maybe it'll be Windows V next. I don't know.
Do you think, this might be like a sort of a pub discussion for later, but do you think the SCO lawsuits against Linux in the, when was that, early, mid-2000s?
Yeah, I know that really well,
Do you
actually.
think that was like a catalyst for Microsoft to say, hey, instead of being like dicks, maybe we'll embrace open
No, I
source?
think I knew SCO really well because SCO stood for Santa Cruz Operations, and I mean, we used to teach it in our corporate division a lot in TRIAS training center before we sold the Polar Bear Nexiant, Global Knowledge, and we made a lot of money. Like, sit a course for $2,500, and you get free bagels and everyone do this stuff already. But the thing is when we went down to California to SCO Unix meetings, they were a great company. They were wonderful. They made the Unix that ran on the Intel platform, which was everywhere. Every Shoppers Drug Mart had a SCO Unix box in the back that had a database that uploaded to head office, stuff like that. They were everywhere. They were huge. And when Linux kicked their butt, they were ready to die. They were like, okay, you know what? It's 2000. There's no need for us to exist anymore. We're all going to go across the street to Sun, which is what was across the street. And they were ready to die. And then last minute, this madman from Novell called Ransom Love, that's his name. And trust me, if you've never met him, he is batshit crazy. Oh my God. Makes Donald Trump look like normal. Yeah. He bought the company, had a big fight with somebody, hired a CEO that was just as crazy as he was. And they were like, oh my God, we bought this company and Linux is killing us. Let's sue Linux. So it really wasn't, most people think, well, a lot of people are kind of ganging up against open source. No, it was just SCO. It was this Santa Cruz Operations in Utah, near Novell, that bought the skeleton of SCO. None of the SCO people went with it. They all stayed in California. Like everyone. I knew a lot of people at SCO. None of them went to Novell. It was basically some people from Novell, and they bought the skeleton of SCO, and they tried to do something with it. They realized, hey, well, they can't sell Unix and the Intel platform because Linux owns that space. So we'll try and make money somehow. We'll sue them. And it ended badly. As it should. They tried to sue the biggest player, which is IBM, the commercial maker. Right? You pick who's got the money to sue, right? You don't sue everybody, right?
But it was kind of a PR disaster, is what I mean. And I'm just wondering if Microsoft saw that and said, well, wait, because they had sort of made veiled threats about their patents and maybe Linux and Android and
I
stuff.
can tell you one thing. I don't remember
They could
what.
license.
Yeah, it could be. You could be right. Here, you know what? I'll say something that kind of substantiates that because I was asked by Microsoft Canada when they first moved to their new building on 1 Mississauga Road in Mississauga. Their old building sucked. Their new building is where it is now. When they first moved there, I can't remember what year that was, but it was around early 2000s. They asked me to come in to one of their board meetings as a Linux expert. And, okay, like just to tell you more about Linux, sure, I'll come. It's free lunch, right? Priorities. So I went, and it was, oh my gosh, this board table was massive, and there must have been 15 people on one side, 15 people on the other. On the right-hand side, my right-hand side, there was 15 developers that looked like they did not want to be there. On the left-hand side were marketing people. These guys were like, Linux sucks, how are they making money? They're taking money from, they were like really, really animated. I was like being, attacked. Like, how can we deal with Linux in our world? And I was like, embrace open source, leverage it, however you see fit. And you got a couple nods from developers who just didn't care about being there. And they were like just mortified. So that was the culture at Microsoft, even Microsoft Canada at that time. So maybe they did take it to the nine. I don't know what the switch was or what the culture change was affected by, what caused that culture change. But I know that Satya Nadella or Nadal, I think is how you pronounce it. Satya Nadal. The old culture at
It's
Microsoft.
a
They
Palmer
clean
Nadal
house.
thing. All those decisions are in Nadal's era. Palmer was so anti
Yeah.
anything that's not Microsoft. And if you go back to the 1998, there is the Harvard conference, which was Eckert is the one who got them. So basically, it's inside Microsoft. There was a lot of email about how do we kill Linux and embrace.
Yeah, you know what? Okay, I kind of recognize how it was on
He
Rockwell.
wrote a whole bunch of documents in '98 based on internal Microsoft documents that someone leaked.
Yeah, you know what they probably did was
Gates himself was
it's not necessarily a bad thing though. Every company I've worked for has got like dartboards with their competitors. I mean, they all talk crap with their competitors. I mean, we did. At every company I worked for, digital was really bad for that. Holy moly.
Just something interesting, and it's a tiny piece of the pie, but I think it was about 10 years ago, there was an interesting little bubble, which is, it turned out Microsoft was the largest contributor to the Linux kernel of any company in the world.
Well, yeah, actually, if you read the EULA, has anyone ever read a EULA, the end user license group? You have, really? I haven't. I just want to know what it's like.
It's great for insomnia.
But it's big. But if you read the XP, Windows XP EULA, there's actually an open source clause in there. They actually use open source software packages from XP onwards. And apparently you can download it from their FTP site. They actually list it in their, EULA, right? You can download the free parts. It doesn't do anything with the rest of Windows, but, so maybe Microsoft early on was doing it, but internally that was probably, there's probably a lot of division there. Because it wasn't until recently that Microsoft really switched, like the last 5, 6 years, right?
Well, and there's a little more to it. So it was really a blip. It popped up and then disappeared and then came back up. And what was happening was they were adding monitoring code. They were extending the Linux kernel to make it so that their tools could monitor. And I think what was happening was the data center was switching over here. And suddenly all of their enterprise customers were like, well, we've got these DNS servers and we've got money. Can you just tell us if they're on? And they're like, well, Scott only works with, can you just tell us if they're on? Okay, we'll write something. And then it kept growing and growing. And
I see. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think
that does make sense,
it
yeah.
was driven
That's
from
cool.
the enterprise saying, a lot cheaper to build a bunch of these than 2 of those. And then them chasing that slowly, and then the tail kind of catches up with the front.
Yeah, I know. But you know what? Even though Microsoft embraces open source, they still do stupid things. Like they have ReFS. Why not just adopt ZFS? ReFS sucks compared to ZFS. I mean, nowhere near like what it can do, right? So I mean, you never know what Microsoft's thinking or what groups have those little empires in Microsoft are doing. But I think they're kind of more now in that same direction, right? So interesting to see how that kind of goes. But yeah, it makes perfect sense for you to say.
So the reason I asked you to bring this slide is this remind me of an article that came in Communication of Asia last year in March. It was a write-up by Andrew Tannenbaum for like 50 years.
Tannenbaum's still alive?
Yeah.
Wow.
He wrote an article about, it was the anniversary of 50 years of operating systems. And he was talking about Minix and how...
Oh, is that the one where he slammed Linus Torvalds?
Kind of.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Because I know he did that in the 90s a lot. But that's not because he was...
It was about his operating system Minix that now is version 3. So he made the point there, and this relates to QNX, that these are microkernels.
Yeah, but the problem with Minix was it was a microkernel, and yeah, it was back in the early 90s. It was considered a good thing to have a microkernel. Now it's actually considered a bad thing to have a microkernel in many ways, just because of the way hardware has evolved. Right? You can have certain microkernel components, but the messaging alone can kill you if it's not done properly.
It depends what your target, because QNX runs nuclear power plants, everything that's reliable.
QNX is an entirely microkernel.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the cars too, yeah. So.
The Apple Mac OS is also...
Well, it's not, actually, Mac OS uses XNU as a kernel, which is a third mock, which is a microkernel, but what they do is they just use they use good and bad parts of the mock, performance-wise, and they take a third of that kernel, which is mock, and then they add the networking part from the BSD kernel, and to glue it together, they have something called IO kit that Next Step used to make that Apple kind of basically upgrades. Problem is doing it that way requires that you have a lot of good developers in the FreeBSD community do it, and they have little blips. Like, do you guys remember when Apple brought all those laptops 5 years ago with SSDs, like the MacBook Airs, and they say it's going to be great performing, and it didn't perform great because they didn't even have trim support in their darn operating system, because the open source developers that made Darwin couldn't get it ready in time? There's blips, right? And that was because of IOKit. They had a problem with IOKit, right? So there's like, you know, I'm not a big fan of microkernels myself, but yeah, Apple for sure is a third of their kernel is actually Mach 3, which is a true microkernel. Mach 2.5 wasn't a true microkernel. It was only Mach 3, and that's what they implemented in the third of the XEU kernel, which is what Apple used.
Your presentation reminds me going back to maybe the Windows 2000 era. As much as Microsoft liked to dismiss and denigrate Linux, if you ran the FTP command line program, instead of / to get help, you had to do the -- help. And if you look through it, you would see the Regents of the University of California copyright notice and things. So they themselves had taken bits and pieces from the BSD world and put it into the Windows distribution. I haven't looked for ages, but I wonder if they ever stopped doing that. Did they ever?
No, they did that. Well, remember, don't forget, Windows ever since NT 3.51 had POSIX compliance, right? And POSIX compliance, portable operating system interface for Unix. So that meant you can still do this today if you want to try it out. Say you have a file on an NTFS file system, and what's the permission in Unix or Linux that allows you to delete a file? It's right on the directory, not right on the file. You can have everything in the file, you can't delete it unless you have right to the directory it's in, right? So to be POSIX compliant, if you have modified to a folder on an NTFS volume, you have no access to a file in there, you can still delete it. Oops. They had to build that into NTFS to make it POSIX compliant, and it's still there. It's still NTFS. So if you can't read it, nobody can. Delete. You know? So yeah, that still works if you want to try it out.
But there are still debates about monolith kernel, yeah, like Windows 10 on Linux, regarding security, yeah, because it's a monolith. If a part fails, everything fails, yeah. While Tannenbaum, he has now Minix version 3, and he is a believer that the microkernels are the future.
Yeah.
From security point of view,
I'll be honest, tombstone when he dies.
Reliability, yeah.
I don't know. I just go with the flow. Whatever's good. It maybe in the future microkernels will change, but it's hardware that kind of changed that. Back in the early '90s, we thought RISC would be the future. That SGI MIPS, that Sun Ultra Spark, and DEC Alphas would rule the world. You know, big powerful machines. You know, watching the Lawnmower Man and Jurassic Park kind of convinced us that would be the case, right? But yeah, things change.
It did happen. Intel is inside its risk, right?
Yeah, I was about to say, it's a risk score.
Yeah, well, there's risk components of everything now, right? Or the transputer. Do you guys know what a transputer is?
Yeah.
Okay, so they had a company called Inmos in the 80s. This company in Britain called Inmos made the first transputer, which is basically a RISC CPU with a lot of RAM on it, and you just slid maybe 5 or 6 transputers into your IBM PC in the ISA slots. And you had a multi-core processor. And because they were funded by academia, they published all their work, everything about their work. So when the company folded, ARM, you know ARM, ripped it off. Said, okay, we'll put multi-core support in an ARM processor. And then Intel and AMD were like, okay, we're going to do multi-core support. We're going to make basically a transputer in hardware. All the legwork was done by this big company, and nobody knows about it. Yeah, isn't that cool? Yeah, there's so much weird stuff in history with computer science. We had transputers at UW, paid a fortune for them. And I managed to smuggle one out before they were destroyed. They actually physically destroyed them. Yeah. That was their policy at the time in that department that they were in, right? But yeah, I still have one at home. But yeah, anything to do with the way we do multi-core processing, not symmetric multi-processing, but multi-core processing, is essentially the same base framework that was approved from transputers and Inmos. Yeah, that was in the 80s. And it was just free. All this stuff was free. where you could just get the whole designs, everything they tried, failed, and worked, and everything was in there. All the legwork was done. You know, ready for any company to just steal it. Beautiful. So, yeah. All right, are we supposed to be done, guys? Or? Oh, we're past time? Okay. Well, I guess we should wrap up then. Does anyone have any other comments or?
I just remember something from the article that I mentioned, Tannenbaum write-up about Linux. There is a point there where he says that Waterloo played a major role in the Linux development because Linux, when he was trying to write the kernel, he didn't have a compiler. So he was using a compiler written by two students from University of Waterloo.
Oh, cool! I didn't know that. Yeah.
And he couldn't find the tool in the new tool set fast enough to help him developing.
Well, there was a lot of Linux going up Waterloo. I remember that. There was a lot in the early '90s. I remember there was a ton of it. And I was kind of like, yeah, Linux is cool, and we kind of install on some machines, play with it, but it wasn't as polished as BSD, so we really didn't care that much. We cared more in the mid-90s when Red Hat came out.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we had it there. I know there's a lot of people that were like heavily into it. The one thing I do remember is Alan Cox. Anyone know Alan Cox? Big, huge guy with a beard, looks like Hagrid from Harry Potter. He wrote the TCP/IP stack for Linux overnight. This guy spends like 11 hours of the day in the pub, and every piece of code he writes is flawless. It's like, I don't know how it's humanly possible. But nobody knew who he was in the Linux community, and then suddenly he comes along and, oh yeah, I finished the TCP/IP stack, here you go. It was like, whoa, people were quitting over that part of the Linux project. Like they were quitting, like people were like, oh, screw this, it's impossible. I'm not doing this part of the project anymore. And Alan Cox single-handedly comes along and does that. If you ever get a chance to meet him, he doesn't talk very much, but if you ever get a chance to meet him, try to ask him some stuff.
Did you write the novel NE2000 driver?
For which operating system? For Linux? I may have. I wrote a lot of drivers and interfaces over the years, and they would have my real name on it, so Jason Eckert. My job at Sun was actually writing drivers and interfaces, so that I got pretty good at it there. And I've written hundreds, and I did contribute a lot to open source projects. MPICH, Beowulf clustering, a lot of the stuff there I wrote myself. So you'll see me as an author for a lot of that, especially that if you use a quadrant switch, all that is, my code. Right? Just farting around and fun. Never familiar.
Jason, I'm interested in the work you did at Trellis at University of Waterloo.
Oh, yeah.
I'm a law librarian.
Oh, okay. You remember, you know Trellis?
Well, yeah, I worked at the University of Wells library for a while.
All right, wait. 1 second. We're gonna clap.
You didn't work in
John,
Boston.
I'm gonna interrupt you. We're gonna clap for him.
Okay, so Trellis is an interesting system. I'll talk about it.
I was going to say, I think if you're willing to stick around, or if you want to come for a drink, there will probably be more people who want to pick your brain. So, thank you very much. If anybody would like to get food or a drink, show of hands, who's going over to the cannery? All right, so pick one of them, follow them, or just over to the Desire to Learn building, and Eckert was just in the corner, and we will be, a bunch of us will be there soon. All right, cool. Thank you very much for coming. See you all next month.
All right, cool.